I reached for the glass because everyone was watching my brother, not me. That was how it had always been in my family. James was the hero, the healer, the man my parents worshipped. I was just his sister, smiling from the edge of the room. Then my husband grabbed my wrist and whispered, "Don't drink that." In that instant, my brother's perfect smile cracked, and I realized the truth might destroy more than his reputation. Before we begin, comment the city you're watching from tonight, and if stories like this speak to your heart, please subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I had spent most of my life learning how to smile beside my brother's applause. That was what I was doing that November evening in Alexandria, Virginia. While rain slid down the tall restaurant windows and the whole room glowed with candlelight, polished silver, and the soft pride of people who believed they were gathered around a good man. My brother, Dr. James Miller, sat near the center of the long, private table, exactly where everyone expected him to be. At 68, he still had the same calm, dignified presence that had carried him through interviews, hospital fundraisers, overseas medical missions, and every family gathering since we were children. He had just received another humanitarian award, one more plaque to place beside the others, one more reason for our parents to look at him as though all their sacrifices had been proven worthwhile. My mother, Helen, kept touching his arm whenever someone praised him, as if she had personally helped place a halo above his head. My father, Walter, sat straighter than usual, his old face warmed by a pride he no longer bothered to hide. Cousins, nieces, old friends, board members, donors, everyone seemed to have a story about James. James in Kenya, James in Guatemala, James in Haiti, James staying awake for 30 hours because a clinic had run out of staff, James holding a child's hand, James raising money when no one else could, James doing what ordinary people only talked about doing. And there I was, Karen Miller Harris, 63 years old, sitting 3 chairs away from him, smiling at the right moments, nodding when someone said my brother had been born with a calling. I had heard that sentence in different forms my entire life. It was not that I hated James. That would have been easier to explain and less shameful to carry. I loved him in the complicated way a sister loves a brother who has filled every room before she enters it. I knew his laugh, his temper, the way he avoided answering direct questions by turning humble, the way he could make a stranger feel chosen in under a minute. I also knew how invisible a person could become beside someone everyone admired. That night, as waiters moved around us with wine and small plates, I told myself what I had always told myself. This was James's night, and I did not need anything from it. My husband, Robert, sat beside me quietly, one hand resting near his water glass. Robert had never liked crowds, and he disliked ceremonies even more. He had spent years in government intelligence work before retiring, mostly as an analyst, though he rarely offered more than that. He was the kind of man who noticed exits before decorations, faces before speeches, pauses before lies. I used to tease him for it. That night, I was grateful for his silence, because mine was beginning to feel heavy. A young server approached from my right and set a glass of white wine near my plate. I remember the small details because, afterward, they would not leave me. The thin stem of the glass, the pale gold color under the candlelight, the faint scent of citrus and oak, the server's sleeve brushing the edge of my chair. I reached for it without thinking. Before my fingers closed around the stem, Robert's hand came down over mine. Not hard enough to hurt, but fast enough to stop me. His voice was low, almost too low for the table, but there was no hesitation in it. "Don't drink that!" For 1 second, I thought I had misunderstood him. Then the table went still. Conversations broke off mid-sentence. My mother's smile froze. One of my cousins gave a nervous little laugh, the kind people make when they are hoping someone will explain the awkward thing away. James looked at Robert, and I expected him to laugh too, to smooth it over, to say Robert had always been cautious. Instead, something passed across my brother's face so quickly I might have missed it if I had not spent 63 years watching him be adored. His smile stopped, not vanished, not collapsed, just stopped. His eyes moved past Robert, past me, toward the bar. I followed that glance. Near the dark wood counter stood a man in a charcoal suit, half turned away as if he belonged to another party. He was not speaking to anyone. He held no drink. He looked ordinary, which somehow made him harder to ignore. Robert saw me looking and leaned closer. "That man," he said, barely moving his lips. "Victor Lane." The name meant nothing to me then, but it meant something to Robert. I felt it in the way his fingers stayed around my wrist, steady and cold. Around us, the family began to recover from the shock by choosing the simplest explanation. Robert had embarrassed James. Robert had overreacted. Robert had ruined the warmth of a beautiful evening. My mother whispered my name as though I had the power to repair what my husband had broken. James lifted his napkin, touched it to his mouth, and gave the room a careful smile, but his hand was not as steady as it had been before. Later, in the hallway outside the private dining room, Robert told me the server who brought my wine had not moved like restaurant staff. He had watched that man switch my glass after a small signal from Victor Lane. And Victor, Robert said, was a face he had once seen in old reports tied to humanitarian funding networks that did not stay clean for long. I stared back through the doorway at my family, still gathered around James, still protecting the shape of him they needed to believe in. If the glass had only been a warning, then who was warning me, and who was trying to make sure I stayed silent? That night, after Robert and I left the restaurant, the rain had slowed to a mist, but I could still feel the dampness of it through my coat as we walked to the car. Neither of us spoke for almost a full minute. Robert kept his eyes moving, not in a dramatic way, not like a man expecting danger around every corner, but with the quiet alertness I had come to recognize over the years. I wanted to ask him a dozen questions. I wanted to demand that he tell me exactly what he knew about Victor Lane, about the switched glass, about why my brother's face had changed at the table. But before I could form any of those questions, another feeling rose inside me, older and more familiar than fear. Shame. I was ashamed that some small part of me had not been surprised to see James at the center of something secret. That was the thought I hated myself for most. Because James had always been the bright one in our family, the one people pointed to when they wanted proof that the Millers had done something right. When we were children, our mother used to keep his report cards in a drawer with tissue paper, as if they were family heirlooms. Mine went on the refrigerator for a week, then disappeared under grocery lists and church calendars. James was not cruel to me then. That was what made it harder. He did not push me aside. He simply stood where everyone had already made room for him, and I learned to make myself smaller without being asked. By high school, teachers were telling my parents he had the mind of a surgeon. By college, neighbors spoke about him as if he belonged partly to the world and only partly to us. When he got into medical school, my father cried. I had never seen him cry over anything I had done, not even when I graduated, not even when I bought my first home, not even when I sat beside my mother for 3 nights after her hip surgery because James was overseas and unreachable. I became the practical daughter. I was the one who knew which pharmacy carried my father's blood pressure medication, which cousin could not sit next to which aunt at Thanksgiving, which bills my parents pretended were not worrying them. I remembered birthdays, anniversaries, dental appointments, the name of my mother's favorite tea. I drove across town when the smoke detector batteries needed replacing. I brought casseroles after hospital visits. I called when storms were coming. None of it was dramatic enough to become a story at dinner. No one raised a glass and said, "To Karen, who noticed." But if James wired money from another continent, or sent a photograph of himself standing beside a clinic wall with tired children leaning against him, my parents would pass the phone around as if they had been handed scripture. I told myself that was fair. His work was bigger. His sacrifices mattered more. Mine were ordinary, and ordinary things did not need applause. Still, ordinary things can hollow a person out when they are expected but never seen. Once, on my 53rd birthday, my parents forgot to call. James had flown in unexpectedly from Honduras that afternoon, and the whole family rushed to my mother's house because he was only staying 1 night. I went too. I brought a cake because someone had to. Halfway through dinner, my mother said, "Isn't it wonderful when all my children are together?" And James kissed her cheek. No one noticed the candles were never lit. Another time, when Robert and I were dealing with a costly roof repair, I mentioned it to my father, not asking for money, only needing to say aloud that I was tired. He patted my hand and told me we all had burdens. A week later, he and my mother wrote a generous check to James's foundation because one of his clinics needed emergency supplies. I did not begrudge the patients. That was the trap. Every hurt in our family could be covered by someone else's greater suffering. James disappointed people too, though no one called it that. He missed my daughter Emily's college graduation because a donor meeting ran long in Boston. He missed my mother's 70th birthday because his flight was delayed after a conference. He promised to visit our father after a minor heart scare, then sent flowers and a note instead. Each time the explanation arrived before the apology. James was carrying so much. James was needed elsewhere. James could not be expected to live by ordinary rules when his life served extraordinary purposes. I repeated those words myself until they sounded like loyalty. Robert heard the exhaustion underneath long before I admitted it. Once, after we had hosted Christmas and my parents spent most of dessert talking about James's new medical initiative, Robert found me alone in the kitchen, scraping untouched food into a container. He said very gently, "You know you're allowed to be hurt." I snapped back that I was not hurt, only tired. He did not argue. That was one of Robert's gifts, and one of his cruelties. He could leave a truth sitting in the room until I had no choice but to look at it. After the dinner in Alexandria, that truth followed me home. I kept seeing James's quick glance toward Victor, not because it proved anything by itself, but because it disturbed the portrait I had spent decades helping my family protect. I had defended James, even in my own resentment. I had told myself that if my brother was worshipped, perhaps it was because he deserved it. But as Robert drove through the wet streets in silence, I stared at the blurred lights beyond the windshield and wondered, for the first time in my life, whether my family had truly loved James, or whether we had loved the shining version of him we had all agreed to keep alive. 3 days after the dinner in Alexandria, I was standing in my kitchen with a cup of coffee, gone cold beside the sink, staring at my laptop as if it had become something dangerous. Robert was in his study with the door half closed, making calls he did not explain, though he never tried to hide them from me either. That was how he handled fear. Quietly, practically, as if panic were a luxury he had trained himself not to afford. I had spent the morning doing what I told myself was harmless curiosity. I searched James's name, then Victor Lane's. I found nothing obvious at first, only old articles, charity pages, medical conference announcements, photographs of James in pale blue scrubs standing beside smiling donors and tired-looking nurses. Victor's name appeared rarely, and when it did, it was in vague language: logistics consultant, regional coordinator, private liaison. The kind of title that sounded important enough to justify his presence and empty enough to explain nothing. I was about to close the laptop when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, with a Virginia area code. I almost let it go to voicemail. Then something in me, some anxious thread pulled tight since Robert's hand had closed over mine at that dinner table, made me answer. "Is this Karen Harris?" a woman asked. Her voice was older, controlled, but not calm. "This is Diane Watkins. I worked with your brother years ago." For a moment, I said nothing. I knew the name in the distant way families know the names attached to old stories. Diane had been a nurse on several of James's international medical projects. I remembered my mother mentioning her once, maybe twice, always with the polite vagueness reserved for people who had once been useful and then disappeared. Diane did not wait for me to invite her further. She said she had seen photographs from the award dinner on a local community page. Someone had posted a short video too, a shaky little clip of Robert stopping me from drinking the wine, framed by the kind of caption people write when they think they have witnessed an embarrassing family scene. Diane had watched it more than once. Then she saw Victor Lane standing in the background near the bar, and she knew the past had not stayed buried. "I am not calling to frighten you," she said, which of course frightened me more. "I am calling because if Victor was there, and your husband noticed him, then someone may already believe you know more than you do." I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. The house felt suddenly too quiet. Diane told me that years earlier, she had begun asking questions about restricted donations, money given for one clinic, one supply shipment, one vaccination program, then quietly moved somewhere else. At first, she thought it was desperation. Field medicine was messy, she said. Emergencies did not respect paperwork. A shipment meant for one village might save more lives in another. She understood that. She had made hard choices herself. But then the pattern grew. Clinics, described in reports as fully staffed, were operating with one exhausted nurse and expired supplies. Equipment listed as delivered had arrived months late, if at all. Photographs were staged carefully, always from angles that showed hope and never what was missing. When Diane pressed for documentation, she was told she did not understand the larger mission. When she pressed again, she was removed from a project she had helped build. "I do not believe your brother was buying houses or hiding money in some private account," she said. That would almost be easier. What scared me was that James believed need gave him permission. He believed that if the outcome was noble enough, the truth became negotiable. I wanted to defend him. The instinct rose in me before thought could stop it. James had slept on clinic floors. James had missed holidays because people were waiting for medicine. James had done more good than most people ever attempted. But every defense sounded, even inside my own mind, too much like the excuses I had heard all my life. Diane gave me dates, project names, the names of 2 clinics I had heard James mention in speeches. After we hung up, I stayed at the table with my phone in my hand until Robert came in and saw my face. I did not cry. I almost wished I could have, because crying would have made me feel innocent. Instead, I opened the laptop again. I went through old newsletters, donor reports, archived photographs, thank you, letters James had forwarded to the family over the years. At first, Victor Lane appeared nowhere. Then I learned where to look. Not in captions, not in official lists, but at the edges, behind James at a ribbon cutting, near a van with medical crates, half turned away at a donor reception. Standing beside a table of signed documents, never central, never named, once I noticed him, I could not stop seeing him. And with every photograph, every careful report, every shining paragraph about my brother's courage, I remembered James at the dinner table, the way his smile had halted for half a second when Robert said not to drink. It had not been the look of a man insulted by suspicion. It had been the look of a man afraid that something carefully hidden was finally beginning to show. The next morning, Robert placed a yellow legal pad on the kitchen table and wrote down every name Diane had given us. He did it slowly, without drama, as if we were planning home repairs instead of touching the edge of something that might destroy my family. I sat across from him, with my hands wrapped around a mug I had not drunk from, watching the careful way he separated facts from fear. Diane had given us 3 former volunteers, one retired pharmacist, and a woman who had once handled shipping records for one of James's overseas clinics. Robert did not push me to call them. He only said, "You need to hear it in voices that are not mine." So I did. By noon, I had spoken to 2 people who remembered James with admiration and pain, tangled together so tightly they could hardly separate them. One woman said money raised for a rural clinic had been redirected after a flood in another region. A man who had delivered medical supplies said numbers in the reports never matched what he saw on the ground. No one described James as greedy. That would have been simpler, cleaner, almost comforting. Instead, they described something harder to face. A man so convinced of his own mission that anyone asking for transparency became an obstacle to saving lives. The stories did not match in every detail, but the shape was the same. Funds moved. Reports softened the truth. Questions were treated like betrayal. By late afternoon, I called James. Betrayal. By late afternoon, I called James. My finger hovered over his name longer than it should have. Part of me still expected my big brother to answer and make the whole thing ridiculous. To explain Victor Lane, the reports, Diane, The glass of wine. All of it. In that calm voice, people trusted before they had even heard the words. When he answered, there was warmth in his tone, but it had a carefulness beneath it. I asked if we could meet. He suggested a quiet coffee shop near Old Town, the kind of place where no one would interrupt him. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting with his back to the wall, coat folded neatly beside him. For a moment, I saw the brother I had known all my life. Tired, composed, impossible not to respect. Then I asked him about the restricted donations. His expression did not change much, but his eyes did. "Karen," he said, "you do not understand what it is like in the field." I waited. He spoke softly, almost kindly, which made it worse. He told me there were villages where children could not wait for committees, clinics where a delayed approval meant empty shelves, mothers who walked for miles only to be told there was no medicine left. He said rules were often written by people who had never stood in a room where a doctor had to choose who received help first. "Sometimes," he said, "you move resources where they will do the most good." He did not deny enough. He explained too much, and as I sat there, I felt something inside me sink. He did not sound like an innocent man defending the truth. He sounded like a guilty man defending the reason he had stopped needing it. The family found out before I was ready. Maybe James told them. Maybe one of the volunteers called someone. In families like ours, secrets never traveled directly, but they always arrived. My mother called first. She was crying before I said hello. "How could you do this to him?" she asked. Not, "What happened?" Not, "Is it true?" Only that. To him. I tried to tell her I was asking questions, not making accusations, but she heard only disloyalty. "You have always had a hard time with the way people admire your brother," she said, and the words landed so cleanly that for a moment I could not breathe. My father called later, and his silence hurt more than her tears. He said, "Karen, this is not who we are." I wanted to ask him who he meant by we, because I had never felt included in that word when James stood in the room. By evening, cousins were texting me. One said I was embarrassing the family. Another said Robert had filled my head with suspicion. Someone wrote that James had saved more lives than I could ever understand. I read each message until the screen blurred, not from tears exactly, but from the old exhaustion of being told that my pain was small because James's work was large. While my family was deciding what kind of villain I had become, Robert followed the thread of the wine glass. He contacted the restaurant manager and asked for the staff list from the private event. The young man who brought my drink was not on it. The manager thought he might have belonged to the outside event crew, but that company had no record of him either. A short section of security footage showed him entering through a service hallway, standing briefly near Victor Lane, then approaching our table. After Robert stopped me from drinking, the man left through a side exit. The glass itself was gone, cleared away before anyone understood it mattered. There was no proof of what had been in it, and maybe there never would be. But someone had wanted that glass in my hand at the exact moment I had begun to notice the man my brother had feared. That was enough to change the question. This was no longer only about James's reputation. It was about truth, responsibility, and the cost of silence. I sat with Robert that night in the dim light of our kitchen while my phone kept buzzing on the table, each message another small demand that I return to my proper place. For most of my life, I had done exactly that. I had stepped back, softened my voice, protected the family story, and let James remain untouched. But not this time. Even if they called it betrayal, even if my mother cried and my father looked at me as if he no longer knew me, I knew I could not turn away. 3 weeks passed between the night I decided not to turn away and the morning we drove to Richmond. They were not dramatic weeks, not in the way people imagine when they hear that a family secret is coming apart. There were no shouted threats at our door, no late-night chases, no sudden confession from James on my voicemail. There were only documents, phone calls, careful pauses, and the slow, miserable weight of knowing that every step forward might take my family farther from anything we could repair. Diane had sent what she had to one board member she still trusted, a woman who had once questioned a budget line and been quietly told not to worry about operational details. That woman did not call the police, did not go to the press, did not make speeches. She did something more dangerous to James's reputation. She asked for an independent audit. By the time Robert and I were invited to Richmond, the Foundation's board had already seen enough to stop pretending this was only old resentment from former staff. The meeting was held in a conference room on the third floor of a brick office building, the kind of place designed to make discomfort look professional. The carpet was gray, the walls were beige, and the long tables shone under flat overhead lights. There was coffee, no one drank, water bottles no one opened, and folders arranged so neatly they seemed almost cruel. Diane was already there when we arrived. She looked smaller than I expected, not weak, but worn down by the cost of remembering. When she saw me, she touched my arm once and said, "Thank you for coming." I wanted to tell her I was not brave. I wanted to tell her I had come because the alternative was going back to being silent, and I no longer knew how to survive that. James arrived 10 minutes later. He wore a navy suit and the same composed expression he had worn in hospital lobbies, donor dinners, and family photographs for decades. For a moment, the room shifted around him the way rooms always did. Even the people who were there to question him seemed to feel the pull of his presence. I felt it too, and that frightened me. Part of me still wanted him to sit down, look around, and restore order simply by being James. Then he saw Diane. His face did not harden exactly. It closed. When he looked at me, there was something almost pleading in his eyes, but beneath it was disappointment, as if I had failed a test he had never told me I was taking. The board chair began quietly. She said the meeting was not a trial. It was an internal review. Everyone present would be given a chance to speak. Robert sat beside me with his hands folded, calm enough that someone who did not know him might have mistaken him for detached. But I knew the line of his jaw. I knew he was measuring every word before it reached the air. When asked what he had observed at the award dinner, he did not mention classified work or make himself sound important. He described the man near the bar, the exchange of a signal, the server who did not appear on the staff list, the switched glass, and the footage showing that same server, leaving through a side exit after Robert stopped me from drinking. Then he explained, carefully, that Victor Lane's name and face were familiar to him from past analytical work involving high-risk humanitarian funding networks. He did not accuse James of ordering anything. He only said the pattern deserved attention. Somehow, that restraint made the room quieter. Diane spoke next. Her voice shook at first, then steadied as she opened her folder. She had emails printed with dates highlighted, copies of supply requests, project summaries, field notes, and messages from people who had been told to stop asking where money had gone. She did not sound angry. That made it worse. Anger would have been easier for James to dismiss. Instead, she sounded tired, precise, and sad. She described a vaccination program that had been celebrated in a donor newsletter, even though half the promised refrigerators for medicine storage had arrived months late. She described a clinic listed as fully operational, while nurses there were borrowing basic supplies from a neighboring district. She described funds raised for one emergency being moved to another without permission, then explained afterward in language so polished it almost became virtue. The auditor, a narrow-shouldered man with silver glasses, did not use emotional language at all. He spoke in numbers, approvals, restrictions, transfers, and missing documentation. His words were dry, but each one struck harder because there was no drama in them. Money had been moved. Not once. Not in confusion. Not in a single desperate hour. Again and again, across years, from restricted accounts into programs the donors had not approved, James listened with his hands clasped on the table. At first, he corrected small details. Then he explained context. Then he objected to the word misused. Finally, after the auditor read out one transfer too many, my brother lowered his head. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. "I did not take that money for myself." No one answered, because no one had said he had. "There were places that needed it more," he continued. "People who could not wait for paperwork. Children who would have died while committees debated language. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and felt my heart break in a way I had not expected. Because I believed him. I believed that he had wanted to save lives. I believed that he had stood in rooms where choices were cruel and time was short. But I also understood, with terrible clarity, that goodness had become the place where he hid from accountability. When I asked about Victor Lane and the glass of wine, James did not confess. He did not say he had known every detail. But he also did not say, with the force of an innocent man, that Victor would never have acted to protect him. He only closed his eyes and said, "Victor handled problems. That was enough." The brother my family had placed above ordinary judgment did not fall because he was a monster. He fell because he had been worshipped so long that he began to believe the truth was something he could move, like money, to wherever he thought it was needed most. The news did not explode all at once. It seeped out first in careful sentences, in a statement from the Foundation, in a short article on a regional news site, in the kind of language people use when they are trying to admit disaster without naming it too plainly. Internal review. Restricted funds. Leadership transition. Questions of oversight. By the end of that week, the words had sharpened. Donors were requesting explanations. A few former volunteers began speaking to reporters. The board announced a broader investigation. James resigned from every leadership role he had spent decades building, and the photographs that once made him look noble now appeared beside headlines asking what had really happened inside his foundation. I watched all of it from my kitchen table, the same place where Diane's first phone call had found me. There was no satisfaction in it. I had imagined, in weak moments, that truth might feel like vindication, that once the world saw what I had seen, some tight knot inside me would loosen. It did not. It only made everything quieter. My brother's name looked smaller in print when it was no longer surrounded by praise. I thought that would bring relief. Instead, it brought grief, because beneath the anger and suspicion and years of being overlooked, he was still James. He was still the boy whose science fair projects filled our dining room, the young doctor my father had bragged about to strangers, the man my mother believed had been given to the world for a reason. Watching him fall did not make me feel taller. It only made me realize how much of our family had been built around keeping him above us. But the collapse that mattered most did not happen in newspapers. It happened in my parents' living room, under the yellow lamp my mother had owned since 1982, while rain tapped against the front window and none of us knew where to sit. My mother was the first to defend him, because of course she was. She had been defending James so long that it had become almost part of her breathing. "He made mistakes," she said, twisting a tissue in her hands. Terrible mistakes, maybe. But he did them because he cared too much. I looked at her and saw not cruelty, but fear. If James was not what she believed he was, then she had to face every time she had chosen his version of events over someone else's pain. She had to face me. Diane came to see her 2 days later at my request, though I did not stay in the room for most of it. I heard only pieces from the hallway, nurses who had been told not to ask questions, volunteers dismissed after reporting shortages, patients waiting in clinics that looked better on paper than they did in real life. Diane never raised her voice. That was what finally reached my mother. Not accusation, not scandal, but the weary steadiness of a woman who had carried the truth too long. When Diane left, my mother sat with both hands folded in her lap and stared at the carpet. "I thought he was fixing broken things," she whispered. "I never thought he might be breaking people on the way." My father said almost nothing for days. Walter Miller had always been a man who could fill silence with authority. But this silence made him look old. He read every article, he kept the television off. He stopped answering calls from relatives who wanted either reassurance or gossip. One afternoon he asked me to walk with him in the small park near their house. The air was cold enough to sting, and damp leaves clung to the path. For a long time we walked without speaking. Then he said, "I don't know when we started treating him like he couldn't be wrong." His voice did not break. That almost made it harder. I wanted, for one sharp second, to unload every forgotten birthday, every dismissed hurt, every time I had been useful but unseen. I wanted to give him the full inventory of my life in James's shadow, but when I looked at him, I saw a father meeting his own failure late, and late was still better than never. So I did not shout. I did not accuse him of loving James more, though part of me still believed he had. I only said, "I don't need you to hate him. I need you to admit that because you loved him so much, you stopped seeing me." He stopped walking then. His face changed slowly, as if the sentence had reached him one word at a time. He did not defend himself. He did not apologize neatly. He only nodded once, and that small nod hurt more than any argument could have, because it was the first time he had not tried to explain my pain away. After that, nothing was fixed, but something was exposed. My mother called me without asking about James first. My father listened longer before speaking. Relatives who had accused me of jealousy grew quieter as more details came out, though very few apologized. James did not call me. I did not know whether he was angry, ashamed, or simply unable to speak to the sister who had helped pull the curtain down. Robert watched me move through those days with a tenderness that made me feel both grateful and raw. One evening, after another article appeared and my phone stayed silent for hours, he stood beside me at the sink and said, "I was afraid I was taking your family from you." I looked at the dark window above the basin, where our reflections seemed older than they had a month before. "Maybe," I said, "they were already gone in ways I didn't want to admit. Maybe all this did was make us stop pretending." He put his hand over mine, the same hand that had stopped me from lifting that glass, and for the first time since the dinner in Alexandria, the silence between us did not feel like dread. It felt like the beginning of an honest grief. 1 year later, James was working in a small clinic outside Fairfax, Virginia, in a low brick building between a laundromat and a discount grocery store. There was no plaque with his name in gold, no framed photographs of him shaking hands with donors, no auditorium waiting for him to speak about courage and sacrifice. The waiting room had vinyl chairs, old magazines, a coffee machine that groaned before it worked, and patients who came in because they had a cough, a swollen ankle, a blood pressure problem, a child with a fever. Most of them did not know who James had been. Some did, I suppose, but they did not care enough to say so. In that clinic, he was not a symbol. He was simply the doctor who came into the exam room, washed his hands, listened, asked questions, and wrote careful notes. The first time I saw him there, I stood in the parking lot longer than I meant to, watching him through the front window as he bent over a clipboard at the reception desk. He looked older, not ruined, but reduced to human size. For most of my life, James had seemed too large for ordinary rooms. Now he belonged to one. We met afterward at a small diner down the road, the kind of place with chipped mugs and waitresses who called everyone honey without meaning anything by it. He arrived without an assistant, without a board member, without anyone waiting to shake his hand. He wore a gray sweater under his coat, and for the first few minutes we spoke about the weather, because neither of us knew how to begin anywhere else. There had been no grand reconciliation between us, no tearful embrace that erased the years. He had apologized once, months earlier, in a letter so careful it felt more like a statement than a confession. Later, in person, he had done better. He had said he was sorry for what he had done, and then, after a long pause, he said he was sorry for what he had allowed himself to become. That was closer to the truth. Still, I did not pretend the apology fixed us. I had spent decades as his sister in the background, translating his absence into nobility, turning my own hurt into something small enough to carry. Sitting across from him now, I understood that we had never really been close. We had been arranged around each other by a family that needed him to shine and needed me not to mind the shadow. James asked about Robert. I told him he was fine, still too observant for his own peace, still pretending the garden belonged to both of us when everyone knew the tomatoes were his project. James smiled faintly. Then he looked down at his coffee and said, "He was right to stop you that night." I did not ask whether he meant the glass, Victor, or all of it, Some answers arrived too late to change anything. Victor was gone from the Foundation's world, though not from memory. The investigation had taken longer than the headlines, as investigations always do, and the Foundation was no longer shaped around my brother's name. Some programs survived under new oversight. Others did not. That was another grief, one people rarely know how to hold. The truth can be necessary and still leave wreckage behind. James had lost his title, his stage, his certainty. I had lost the story that had helped me explain my family to myself. My parents changed too, but not beautifully, not all at once. My mother began calling me on Tuesday mornings, sometimes for no reason. At first, her questions sounded practiced, as if she had written them down before dialing. How was I sleeping? Had Emily visited? Was Robert's knee still bothering him? She still mentioned James, of course. He was her son, and love does not disappear just because illusion does. But she no longer made him the doorway into every conversation. My father remembered my birthday that year. He came by with a grocery store cake and a card he had signed 3 times, as if the right words might appear if he kept trying. We ate cake at my kitchen table while Robert made coffee, and my father listened when I talked about my life. He interrupted once out of habit, then stopped himself. That small effort nearly broke me. It was not enough to repay the years, but it was something. Sometimes healing begins not as warmth, but as awkwardness no one runs from. I do not say my family was healed. That would be too neat, and truth is rarely neat. James lost the admiration he had mistaken for permission. My parents lost the comfort of believing one child's greatness could excuse another child's loneliness. I lost the old family story, the one where my role was to understand, to forgive early, to stand aside gracefully. But I also found something I had not known how badly I needed, my own place. Not above James, not against him, not in the light stolen from him, but simply mine. When I think back to that night in Alexandria, I still remember Robert's hand closing over mine and the quiet command that changed everything. Don't drink that. At first, I thought he was saving me from a glass. Later, I understood he was stopping me from swallowing one more silence. The truth did not heal us quickly. In some ways, it hurt more before it helped. But it made us honest. And I have come to believe that reputation is not character. Goodness is not accountability. And sometimes loving someone means finding the courage to say, stop, before they go too far. Looking back now, I no longer think miracles always arrive as sudden blessings or bright answers from heaven. Sometimes God works more quietly, through a hand stopping us, a truth we resisted, or a painful moment that finally opens our eyes. My family was not healed in one day, and maybe yours will not be either. But in ordinary kitchens, quiet car rides, phone calls, apologies, and hard conversations, grace can still find a way in. If this story reminded you of someone you love, share it with them. If it touched your heart, leave a comment and tell us what truth helped you heal. Subscribe for more stories like this. And when tomorrow feels ordinary, may you notice the small mercies God places in your path. May God bless you, protect your home, and give you courage to choose honesty over silence.